everyone, and welcome to Parenting Beyond the Headlines. I'm Sarah Cody here with my friend Amy Alamar. We are very excited to be on Spreaker now, so you can find us all over the podcast world. We're so excited, Amy.
Yeah, that was a big win for us. So we're excited to be out there on more platforms. And today we're going to be talking about vaping. And this isn't the first time we've talked about vaping because it's come up. Obviously, we talk about families, we talk about what's in the news, but there have been some recent stories, really alarming stories about illness and death related to vaping. We're super excited to be joined by a true expert in the field, Dr. Stan Glantz, Professor of Medicine and Director of the UCSF Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education. Thank you, Stan, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's in the news today that Juul has halted the flavored pod sales amidst continued criticism. And as Amy indicated, you know, I work at a news station almost every day. We've been doing stories lately about the lung-related illnesses, the lung-related deaths even. So what has changed all of a sudden? Where did this illness come from? Is this new? Is this a product of a tainted pod? What's going on?
Well, before I answer that question, I just want to say Juul's decision to stop selling its non-menthol flavors is a lot less than meets the eye, because the menthol flavors are by far and away the most popular flavors with kids. And the other thing that people found in looking at sales data is when they stopped selling some of the other flavors in stores, kids just bought more menthol flavors. So if Juul was really going to do something meaningful, they would stop selling all flavors, including menthol. And if they really wanted to do something meaningful, they would simply stop selling the product entirely until it's gone through a proper review by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So now, to answer the question you asked about what's going on with all this lung disease, the short answer is nobody knows. I mean, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and the FDA, and also people at the NIH have created working groups. There are many very smart people working on this. And the precise reasons that we're seeing all of these very serious lung disease, people still haven't figured that out. Now, there are some indications, though, that these problems have been around for a long time. The first case report of the kind of lung disease that we're now talking about appearing in someone using e-cigarettes was published 8 years ago, back in 2011.
Okay.
And there have been kind of sporadic case reports of this very severe lung disease associated with using e-cigarettes, you know, every once in a while over the last few years. And it wasn't until we had 8 cases all appear at about the same time in about the same place in Wisconsin that somebody said, "Oh my goodness, there's something's going on here," and then, you know, started looking at it as what epidemiologists call an outbreak. What they're finding, though, is that the more they look, the more cases that they're finding. And, you know, my guess is, and this is just an educated guess, is that, you know, these problems have been around for quite a long while, but e-cigarette use, you know, has been only increasing a lot in the last few years. And so while we may have had problems earlier, there just weren't enough kids using e-cigarettes to be having the problems manifest. Also, the newer e-cigarette products develop much smaller aerosol particles, the mist that you inhale. And the smaller you make those particles, the more deeply they get into your lungs. And so it may be that the early generation e-cigarettes weren't making particles that were small enough to create these kind of problems down deep in your lungs.
Now, you said e-cigarette use has really increased drastically. I mean, I remember when they first came out, it was sort of marketed as a great way to get off of smoking. And from the materials you shared with me earlier, it seems like the e-cigarettes are not a good source for that.
Right. E-cigarettes, the original hope for e-cigarettes, and certainly the way they're still being promoted to this day, and in fact, even the FDA is saying this, is that e-cigarettes are a viable, quote, off-ramp from smoking. And that evidence just doesn't support that, at least when you're talking about e-cigarettes in popular use as a consumer product. There's no doubt that some people have successfully used e-cigarettes to stop smoking cigarettes. But if you look at the population as a whole, people who use e-cigarettes are actually less likely to quit smoking than people who don't use e-cigarettes. So at a population level, they're actually making the tobacco epidemic worse. Now, there are a few randomized clinical trials of using e-cigarettes as medicines, where you're using them as a smoking cessation aid as part of a clinically supervised quit smoking effort combined with very, very intense counseling. And for that, they do seem to work. But that's a very different situation than going out and picking them up at a 7-Eleven or your local vape shop. And, I think it would make a lot of sense for the e-cigarette companies to submit their products as smoking cessation devices to be used under prescription and see if the FDA will approve them. It's pretty clear that in terms of efficacy, that is helping people quit smoking if you're using it as part of a clinically supervised smoking cessation attempt. They do seem to work, but they don't work any better than the other established FDA approved therapies that are in the market. And there's a lot of side effects that you don't have with the conventional therapies. I mean, e-cigarettes seem to increase the risk of heart attacks and heart disease about as much as a cigarette. We have all these lung diseases that we've been talking about. And while it's too early to say anything definitive about cancer, there's also emerging evidence that they're increasing cancer risks, even though you don't set them on fire the way you do a cigarette.
Go back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about the illnesses and deaths that have been in the news. I think vaping advocates are saying, this is coming from the black market. This is an anomaly that's with the bad black market vaping. But you're saying not so. Perhaps these illnesses have been there and just not talked about.
Yeah, I think this issue of a black market is it's a red herring, because first of all e-cigarettes on the market today are illegal. Under the 2009 Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, which gave the FDA jurisdiction over e-cigarettes, it's illegal to sell a tobacco product in the United States without what's called a marketing order from the FDA, where the FDA has certified that the sale of the product is, quote, appropriate for the protection of public health. That's the standard in the law. Now, cigarettes that were grandfathered in. Anything that was on the market in February of 2007 is allowed to remain. But e-cigarettes weren't. And so in order to legally sell an e-cigarette in the United States, it's supposed to be reviewed by the FDA and approved for sale. And to date, not a single e-cigarette has been approved by the FDA. And it wasn't until mid-October of 2019 that an e-cigarette company even applied for FDA review. So, from a legal point of view, they're all illicit.
And how do we have vape shops? How do we have them being
sold? I think the FDA simply isn't enforcing the law.
Okay.
When the FDA issued the rule that gave them authority over e-cigarettes, which took place in 2016, all the e-cigarettes instantly became illegal because they were tobacco products under the jurisdiction of the FDA that had not been FDA approved. And the FDA said, well, we're willing to give the e-cigarette companies 2 years to get their applications into us. We promise to review them within another year. So, the public health people were kind of unhappy that they gave them this 2-year grace period, but it wasn't. It was okay. So if that had actually gone into effect, the only e-cigarettes on the market today would be ones that the FDA has reviewed and said are okay to sell. because that grace period ended a few months ago. When Scott Gottlieb came in under Trump as the FDA commissioner, he took that 2018 deadline and pushed it out to 2022. And he said, we want to just give these products time to develop and the market to mature. I think that was like unbelievably irresponsible. And by doing that, it really allowed this current mess we have to develop. And a court has now ordered the FDA to pull that grace period back to next May. But, as of today, none of the e-cigarettes on the market have been properly evaluated.
I'm glad you cleared that up because I don't think people know that.
So, that's the first problem with the argument that you're making. The second idea that this is somehow a tainted batch of products or something, kind of odd. The thing that makes that highly unlikely is that these pulmonary cases are now in every single state. Mm-hmm. And even though Juul dominates the nicotine e-cigarette market, they don't totally control it. And the cases which have been reported are with a wide variety of products, including products using THC, marijuana vaping, cannabis vaping. And to me, the chances that there's like one weird contaminant that's appeared all over the country in this wide range of products, it's just not, I mean, it's possible, I suppose, but I think it's highly unlikely.
Okay.
And I think the chances are much greater that the problems that we're seeing are endemic to the product itself. And also, it's probably not just one thing about the product which are creating these problems. If you're vaping THC or marijuana, the carrier liquids tend to be kind of oily, and you're getting these very teeny weeny little droplets down into your lungs that are maybe a 50th or the 100th the size of a human hair. And it may be that there are cells in your lungs called macrophages which gobble up foreign materials, and these droplets are clogging up the macrophages. There's some very good research showing that the propylene glycol vegetable glycerin mixture used in the nicotine e-cigarettes reacts with something called surfactant, which is kind of a soapy substance that lines your air sacs and helps keep them open. And that's creating these little tiny fatty particles. These compounds trigger a lot of inflammatory processes. Heavy metals boil off the e-cigarette coils. The nicotine itself has a lot of adverse effects on your lungs. And so, I think there's a whole range of things going on here. And I don't see any way that they're going to be able to engineer them out of the products.
So Amy and I both have friends that in the last few weeks have said to us, we are responsible vapors. What is your response to that?
Well, lungs are made to breathe in air, not to breathe in an aerosol of propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, all kinds of flavoring agents, vitamin E acetate if it's a THC product. That's not what your lungs are designed to deal with. You're putting quite toxic substances in. The original idea of an e-cigarette from 10, 15 years ago, it's not a crazy idea. A cigarette works by you set the tobacco on fire, and that generates an aerosol of ultrafine particles that carries the nicotine down deep into your lungs where it gets absorbed and quickly sent to your brain. And when you set the tobacco on fire, you generate a lot of bad chemicals, a lot of cancer-causing chemicals and oxidizing agents and other bad things. And the idea of an e-cigarette is that you generate the aerosol of ultrafine particles by heating up a wick soaked in the e-liquid. So you don't have the fire. You're still taking a lot of toxic chemicals and heating them up pretty hot. Not as hot as setting them on fire, but still pretty hot. And then you're inhaling the results of that chemical process. And I think one of the things that we've learned, especially in the last couple of years, is that inhaling those ultrafine particles, even though they're generated differently from a cigarette, is still very, very dangerous.
I mean, this is very important for us to understand, and people listening to this podcast are going to be better armed with information to share with their kids. What can we do, or what do you see happening? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of this like crazy marketing campaign? I mean, you've dealt with this in the past with the tobacco companies, right? So like there's this crazy marketing going on, there's misinformation, there's lack of regulation. So, you know, what can we do as parents and our listeners as parents to kind of help with the education piece at least?
Well, I think there are several things that you can do. First of all, a lot of kids think e-cigarettes are just harmless water vapor and flavors. And just tell them they're not water. There's no water in an e-cigarette. You're breathing in a whole lot of toxic chemicals. The flavors themselves can be quite dangerous. The things that are fine to eat, things like butter flavor and cinnamon flavor, which are just delicious, you know. If you aerosolize them as oils and inhale them, really tear up your lungs and your blood vessels. These things are part of the tobacco industry now. I mean, Juul, which is the dominant e-cigarette company, while it's not a subsidiary of Philip Morris Tobacco, Philip Morris owns 35% of Juul, and the two top people at Juul are now high-level Philip Morris executives who were brought over to get it approved by the FDA. So I think people need to appreciate these products are tobacco products. The e-cigarette industry is, by and large, the tobacco industry. Now we have the vape shops, which are kind of off to the side and independent of big tobacco, but they're being pushed out by the tobacco companies. And the other thing is, if you go into a vape shop, I mean, my wife, who's a nurse, when she goes by these things, it's like, oh, there's a compounding pharmacy dealing with a lot of toxic chemicals without any pharmacists, you know. And I think the idea that people are taking these highly toxic chemicals, things which have been banned as pesticides like nicotine, and mixing them up themselves and inhaling them, it's like crazy. Another thing I think to do is to get politically organized. I mean, the FDA, in my view, has been asleep at the switch on this for years. And the FDA are friends of mine. They fund a big research center that I direct. So I tell people the FDA at least are open-minded, nice people. But I think they've completely mismanaged this situation from the beginning. So I think working locally, politically, to get flavor bans passed. We have a law here in San Francisco now that says in January you can't legally sell e-cigarettes until they've been cleared by the FDA. I think more laws like that. Mm-hmm. And definitely they shouldn't be getting sold to kids. But the real problem is not, you don't want to be criminalizing the kids. I mean, the problem are the companies selling products, and I think there need to be legal constraints put on the companies to make it harder for them to go chasing after the kids, not, you know, trying to like punish the kids if they get victimized by these companies. Another thing, I'm very, very worried that in the end, the FDA is going to authorize the sale of these products. And I think the FDA, there's a public process. I think parents need to be involved in this. They need to be contacting the FDA, contacting their Congress people, and telling them, like, we don't want these on the market until there's evidence that they're not killing people. And, you know, the irony in all this is that had the e-cigarette companies put in their request for FDA authorization 3 years ago, when they could have, they would have had a much easier time getting them approved than they will today, because all of this stuff we're talking about, all of these lung cases, most of the evidence on heart disease, people didn't even know that 3 years ago. The science in this area is moving very, very fast. And the more we learn, the worse they look.
It seems like after all this mess that we've been reporting day after day after day after day, the fact that you're saying they still could be approved surprises me.
It surprises me too. I mean, if you look at the statements coming out of the Centers for Disease Control, they're telling people to stop vaping everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because some of the people are vaping marijuana, some of the people are vaping nicotine, and some of the people are using both products. And the CDC is saying, we don't know what's causing this, and people should stop using them all, which is the sensible thing to say. If you look at the FDA, they're telling people you shouldn't be vaping the THC products. And they're being a little waffly about the nicotine e-cigarettes. They did point out in their last public statement that no nicotine e-cigarette has been approved by the FDA for marketing, and no nicotine e-cigarette has been approved by the FDA as a smoking cessation device. But they don't say, therefore, you should stop using all of these products. And I think the sensible thing for parents to be telling their kids is that you shouldn't be using any of these things until we know what's causing these problems. You can be giving yourself very, very, very serious lung disease. There's a couple things that we have worked very well on tobacco, on conventional cigarettes, that I think we need to be pushing around the e-cigarette issue. The first is that, these are tobacco companies that are making billions of dollars by addicting kids. And kids should realize these companies are not their friends, and they should not want to affiliate with them by buying their products because they're getting ripped off.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, while it is a huge problem that about a quarter of kids are now using e-cigarettes, the fact is 3/4 of them aren't. And I think we haven't put enough energy into talking to the 3/4 that aren't and saying to them, when some kid uses an e-cigarette around you, they're polluting the air. You're breathing in a lot of poison chemicals that are coming out of the people exhaling the e-cigarette aerosol. And you should tell anybody using an e-cigarette to go away. Yeah. Just go outside. We want our bathrooms back.
That's been a real issue in the schools is, kids don't want to go in the bathroom because they smell terrible and they feel uncomfortable in there. And that's another issue.
Right. And I think, it sounds sort of trivial, but I think we need to run a Take Back the Bathrooms campaign.
Yeah.
And I think that the vast majority of kids who are not using these products need to say to the minority who are, you can't do this in the bathroom. We want to be able to go pee without getting asphyxiated.
Yeah.
And, if you go back 20, 25 years, that's the same battle we had over cigarettes and secondhand smoke. The fact is, e-cigarettes, people who are around people using e-cigarettes are being exposed to the air pollution caused by the exhaled aerosol.
Yeah.
And I think the kids need to be getting organized to say and to just throw the vaping kids out of the bathrooms. And it's not to say to them, you can't do this. It's to say to them, you need to do it somewhere where it isn't going to hurt me.
Yeah. That's fantastic advice and a lot of really good information. I'm so appreciative that we had a chance to chat with you today. Thank you again for joining us, Stan. It's really great to have you on.
And thank you, listener, for spending this time with us. We will certainly be back with more hot topics coming up on Parenting Beyond the Headlines. Have a great day.